Hold on a second. You use that kind of language like feet held to the Maoist flames. And then I know that you talk a lot about polarization. Don't you think that's adding to the polarization? Like you're talking about Mao and you're invoking this idea of fire, serious communism. Isn't that a little bit severe?
I don't think it's any more severe than starting with the assumption that I'm part of the alt-right.
Hey there, Mug Clubber and or YouTuber. We are introducing a new segment today. Long-form interview called Devil's Advocate, where we'll bring on the foremost conservative thinkers, critical thinkers, and try to present both points of view. I think it was my friend Owen who actually said, if you cannot argue your ideological opposition's point of view as effectively as they can, you have no business holding your own position. So the purpose of this format is to argue the progressive left's position more effectively than they do, and to hopefully equip you in case you will encounter these arguments, these lines of questioning, these specific patterns of attack that you see from the left. So I warn you, you might get mad, you might get frustrated, you might want to beat up Skyler. I know that I did. These do not represent my views at all or the views of anybody at Louder with Crowder unless I don't know about it. Enjoy Devil's Advocate with Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Devil's Advocate
With Skyler Turden. All right, I am your host, Skyler Turden. This is a segment where we take on the biggest right-wing personalities on the web, out there sort of in the cultural sphere, and challenge them, hold their feet to the fire to see if their ideas hold water. And our next guest is very popular, so very noted fascist, super popular internet personality. You can take his personality quiz, I guess, at selfauthoring.com. His book is 12 Rules for Life, is available at places. Jordan Peterson, thanks for being on the show, sir.
Thanks for the invitation there, Skyler.
Yes. So let me allow you to sort of establish with people who aren't necessarily familiar. You've made it your main goal to be an advocate of free speech, particularly speaking out against restrictions thereof. I know it started, you sort of rose to notoriety with Bill C-16 in Canada. Tell us in your own words, why freedom of speech is so important and why you took your stand.
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think that that's what I put myself forward as in the main.
Okay.
I'm actually very interested in the relationship between meaning and responsibility.
Okay.
And so I think that my books and my lectures are mostly devoted towards that. I see free speech as necessary because it's part of the process by which the left and the right continue in an ongoing dialogue about how society should both maintain and update its structures, and that any attempts to interfere with that are dangerous to both necessary wings, let's say.
Okay.
And in Canada, there was a bill passed a year ago in May, Bill C-16, which purported to do nothing but extend charter rights and certain protections under the criminal code to transgender people. But that isn't how I looked at the legislation. I thought it was a piece of compelled speech. And the justifications for doing that were very thin.
Well, okay, let me ask you that. So first off, okay, meaning and responsibility where they intersect, but freedom of speech is a big component to that, right? And that's why you talk about it.
Well, it's a responsibility to speak properly, and it shouldn't be something that the government should interfere with. The government interferes with that at its peril, whether it happens to be left or right-leaning.
Well, I just want to make sure I wasn't, because you made it sound like I was misrepresenting you, but it sounds like, no, that is a big part of it. So the thing with Bill C-16, right? You say that. I've read through the bill. I've not seen anything that specifically relates to compelled language. You often use that word, compulsion of language. I don't see it in there.
That's because it was a particularly treacherous piece of legislation, and most of what was reprehensible about it was hidden in the surrounding documentation, mostly on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. The federal government announced publicly before they took the link down that the bill would be interpreted in light of the documentation on the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which clearly made it grounds for civil action, at least, and perhaps criminal action to misgender someone, despite the lack of any norms currently operating with regards to the use of gender pronouns, for example. And it also instantiated a social constructionist view of gender into Canadian law, which I thought was equally reprehensible, given that the scientific evidence is overwhelming that a substantial part of gender differences in biology and personality and temperament are biologically influenced, if not determined.
Right, and I know then we can get into sort of this biological determinism I know is really popular with the alt-right and in that sphere, but it sounds to me like what you just said, before we move on to more freedom of speech and the meat of some of your other topics that you discuss, sounds to me like you're talking about a potential interpretation of the law provincially, but that's not what the law said, and considering that's like the catalyst for you, here's this rock star on the right, don't you think that's a little important?
I don't think that there would have been inclusions within the law of changes to the criminal code if the intent wasn't much broader. And the law was only about a paragraph long, and so the surrounding documentation is of crucial importance. And if the federal government was playing straight with regards to the origin of the law and how was it going to be interpreted, they wouldn't have taken down the link that had made the claim quite straightforwardly that it was going to be interpreted in light of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's already extant policies, which surrounded similar legislation at the provincial level. Besides, it played out exactly the way I thought it would play out. For example, at Wilfrid Laurier University, where a teaching assistant was had her feet held to the Maoist flames for daring to show a video expressing my views to a communications class.
No, you
so no, I don't think I
hold on a second. You use that kind of language like feet held to the Maoist flames. And then I know that you talk a lot about polarization. Don't you think that's adding to the polarization? Like you're talking about Mao and you're invoking this idea of fire, serious communism. Isn't that a little bit severe?
I don't think it's any more severe than starting with the assumption that I'm part of the alt-right, which is a white supremacist organization and an identity politics group.
Who said you were part of the alt-right? I didn't say you were part of the alt-right.
Yeah, you did, actually. You could just rewind the tape.
No, I mentioned that it was popular in alt-right circles, and you happen to be popular in alt-right circles. Listen, if I happen to be popular at universities, and they show, I'm not responsible for what those professors say. I'm just saying it's your views. Would you disagree happen to coincide with the views of a lot of the alt-right?
Yeah, I would disagree.
Okay.
I don't think they agree with the alt-right at all. In fact, I have some very pronounced enemies on the alt-right, and they've come out and said exactly that, because I've said in multiple public appearances that I'm no fan of collectivists. I don't really care if they're on the left or on the right. It's equally reprehensible as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well...
So there's just two different ways of playing identity politics. There's a left-wing way and a right-wing way, and I'm not in favor of either of them.
Yeah.
So I think any attempt whatsoever to associate me with the alt-right, regardless of whether you have an opinion that I have followers there, is merely an attempt to
Sure. And
denigrate what I'm saying by association.
Well, I don't want. Listen, that's not what I'm trying to. I was mentioning it is popular. These are popular in the alt-right circle, but they do disagree.
What's your evidence for that?
But no, you're right. They do disagree with you, and largely because you're Canadian. There's a split there with American alt-right and Canada. But let me go back to what you were just talking about here. Sort of, you mentioned biology. Now, let's say that I agree with you, right? Biology, and it's a big determining factor in gender. Let's, for the sake of argument, act like gender and sex are the same thing. I'm assuming, obviously, you haven't really familiarized yourself with Simone de Beauvoir or Judith Butler, but that's cool. So
familiar enough.
Well, yeah, okay, familiar enough, and that's the danger with a lot of people.
Judith Butler.
Yeah, well, that's the danger with a lot of people. They're only familiar enough. But let's assume that it's correct, okay, and that biology determines gender. I don't think we would disagree that transgenders have been the victim of hate crimes at a disproportionate rate, and this is the complication that I think a lot of right-wingers miss. They see it; they're very reductive. Permitting absolute freedom of speech, it silences other people's free speech because it allows people to bully victims into silence, and then you have freedom of speech if it's blanketed. Actually reduces the totality of free speech because of minorities who are afraid to speak out. Is that a problem that you agree with?
Well, there's no doubt that speech can be misused and commonly is. The question isn't the issue. The issue is who's going to regulate it. And the answer to that is minimal regulation, because it's such a fundamental part of the ability to think and orient yourself in the world. And so it's perfectly reasonable to point out that free speech can be abused and has been in the past, but then the devil's in the details.
Right.
Say, well, it's been used to oppress minorities, well, also to free them. We might point out the left wing was a tremendous advocate for free speech right up until, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago, partly because people who are oppressed need free speech above all else to make their claims heard. I mean, that's always been the fundamental.
But that's not how it's playing out. That's
well, it's not how it's playing out for 5 years. I don't know what the hell that has to do on the broader scheme of things. You can be sure that any restrictions that the left manages to put on free speech will immediately be co-opted by the right. So it's an extraordinarily foolish game. And there's an issue that's even deeper than that, which is, well, we've already agreed that speech can be, let's say, harsh and divisive and oppressive, all of those things. Who's going to regulate it? Whose hands are you going to put that power in?
Well, here's the thing. I think you do this a lot, and people on the right do this a lot, where they sort of act like this government is this far-off entity who makes these decisions in Washington, D.C. Listen, it's us, right? We're a democracy here in the United States. People vote in their representatives. So the government is us. I pay my taxes. I get water that comes from my tap at the same speed as I get access to the freeways as anyone else. We do agree, when we live in a society, that a government has certain control. I mean, we don't complain about other regulations, and this is where I think
we complain about any regulation that transgresses constitutional rights, and the right to free speech is probably the primary right, at least in the U.S.
Okay, but
so it's also the right upon which the entire government edifice is built, and to say that you can elect representatives who are going to regulate free speech ignores the fact completely that you don't have an absolute democracy, you have a constitutional democracy.
Well, these same regulators, they're in charge of what can be said as far as libel laws with the press. So we do have a freedom of the press, but we do have actual libel laws. There are regulations on firearms, right? You don't think that you should be able to go off and own a tank. So again, these are constitutional amendments. Libel laws, like we discussed, those would fall under freedom of the press, the First Amendment, with freedom of speech. Why?
I think the restrictions that are placed on free speech are already plenty sufficient. Okay. And to extend them to any degree is a very big mistake. And besides, there's a huge difference with regards to compelled speech. I should point out that your American Supreme Court in the 1940s made compelled speech unconstitutional. So Canada passed a law that would be clearly unconstitutional in the United States. It was also a law passed at the federal and provincial level because it compelled speech that had absolutely no precedent in English common law. Because there's a difference between saying what people can't say, sure, and so that's libel, and saying what they have to say, which is compelled speech. And the Supreme Court said very explicitly in the United States that it was a mistake both on the part of restricting the speaker and restricting the listener to compel people to utter words with which they did not agree. Now, there's certain exceptions for commercial law, but there are no exceptions in non-commercial speech. And so to bring in libel law and that sort of thing is a complete red herring.
Well, hold on. I want to be sure, because you just mentioned red herring here. You say, so I want to make clear that I understand. Your problem is with compelled speech then, correct? Not saying what you can't say, but forcing people as to what they can.
Well, I'm absolutely no fan whatsoever of hate speech legislation, but which is I suppose the logical extension of laws attempting to restrict what you can't say.
Right.
So I think hate speech laws are dreadful, and I think they're being misused all the time, and that we've only seen the beginning of that. But the issue of compelled speech is worse than the issue of regulating hate speech, because it requires people to utter words that they did not formulate and may not believe. So it violates freedom of conscience. It violates the responsibility that each individual has to only say things they believe to be true and representative of their viewpoint. It interferes with their ability to think and communicate, and it makes them terrified of potentially terrified of government and other organizational intervention.
Well, people are terrified right now because the First Amendment was written long before social media and Facebook, and so now the speech is very invasive. You used to be able to turn it off. Now you can't. We'll come back to that because I know we have a lot of topics to get into, and as in your words, you're not just an advocate of free speech, but the sort of where meaning intersects with responsibility. You just brought up hate speech laws, so I think it's a good transition. Jordan, do you support equality?
It's a trick question. So how about you specify it a little bit more clearly before I answer that?
Okay. Do you support equality of race, gender, sexual orientation?
Same objection applies. Define equality. Equality of opportunity for sure.
Equality of treatment.
Not in the least. Again, it's insufficiently defined question.
Okay.
Equality of treatment.
All right.
Equality of opportunity for sure. I think that any bureaucratic structure that's set up that doesn't allow each person to be assessed on the basis of their merits in relationship to a particular function, like a job, is a big mistake for everyone involved, including the individuals that are unreasonably discriminated against. So
Sounds like a long way around to say no. Let me ask you this: you've spoken out against the problem of free speech in regards to speakers, specifically on campus, universities, people being censored on social media. Let me ask you that: is that even a question like of speakers, for example, on campus? Is it a question of free speech at all? Isn't that just a private entity refusing to serve an individual whose message they don't agree with, not hosting them?
Well, it's certainly not the case in Canada because the universities are public.
Okay.
And that's also the case in many universities in the United States. So, and then with regards to the private entities, I suppose it depends on why they're doing it and under what pressure they're operating. I mean, a typical trick now is to charge the individuals who are coming to campus outrageous security fees to prevent them from being able to speak. So there's plenty of what would you call it? There's plenty of lack of fair play at work in those sorts of situations.
So
I think universities above all should be cautious about restricting who's allowed to speak on campus for ideological reasons.
Oh, I agree. I think they should be super careful. So I want to make sure that you only have a problem, not with private universities, but public universities?
I didn't say I didn't have a problem with private universities
Okay,
doing
well,
it. I
that's what I'm
said it's clearly a problem with public universities doing it. With private universities, there is that additional element that you just described.
Okay. So would you compel public universities to host speakers they disagree with?
Define compel.
Force them to host speakers they disagree with?
I would encourage them to leave speakers alone. If student organizations invite them onto campus, then the university should do what it can to keep ideology out of the picture and to allow them to speak.
Right. So public university is saying, okay, for us, Jordan Peterson is aligned because of his misgendering of people and his anti-trans, so to speak, or some of his whatever you want to use it, homophobic, anti-left-wing rhetoric, and then another university.
Well, that's a typical example of exactly why it's very dangerous to let ideologues determine where the free speech line is drawn, because in formulating that question, you used a whole string of unwarranted epithets that you drew from very badly conducted press interviews to characterize my viewpoints. And so just by formulating the question the way you did, you indicated how terribly dangerous it is to allow committees of ideologues to determine who should be allowed to speak and on what topic.
Well, let me ask you this then. First off, you're saying you don't see yourself as having spoken any anti-transgender rhetoric at all?
No.
Really?
It has nothing to do with transgender. It has nothing to do with transgender individuals. It has to do with compelled speech.
Okay.
The fact that it happened to involve a bill that involved transgender people was more I would say an accident. That was the issue that brought this to rise.
So you'll use the people's preferred pronouns then?
I haven't, and it would depend on how I was asked. It would depend on which pronouns, and it would depend on what I thought their motivation for requiring them was, and it would depend on whether they demanded it and all of that. So at the moment, I'm very disinclined to do it because now I have to do it. I'm legally compelled to do it in Canada, and that's enough reason for me to say no.
Well, it sounds to me like that you said that you gave a lot of depends for someone who believes in...
Yeah, that's for sure. You don't have the right to determine how I address you.
Well, you don't have the right to deny their reality, to deny who they are, how they identify. Why? So then it just
I deny people's reality all the time by disagreeing with them. So, and they do the same to me. And you have every right to deny someone's reality. That's the whole basis of your ability to think independently, is that you get to define reality one way and other people get to define it another way. And then hopefully you negotiate a shared reality that you can both live in peacefully.
Well, that's my point.
So that's a completely specious argument.
Well, no, that's my point, is because for someone who does talk about moral absolutism to some degree, in this case, there are a lot of depends. And for example, if a black guy said, hey, I'm black, you can just say, no, you're not. And then can you use racial epithets or what he considers racial epithets? I mean, because people in the trans community...
Can I? Of course I can. Whether I should or not is a different issue, and whether or not it should be illegal is a completely different issue. So whether I
But
can
it
and
is
whether I
illegal.
should are not the same thing. No, it's not.
It's illegal
actually not illegal.
to go out and if a black guy to call him the N-word. That would be illegal.
It's not
because there's
illegal.
harassment. It's harassment if you continually do
It's
it after
not
the answer
illegal.
stop.
It's not illegal in the United States.
Well, okay, I agree to disagree on that one because
There's no disagreeing about it. It's not illegal.
yeah. Well, go see how that works if you go on down to Spanish Harlem. Just be sure to upload it with a GoPro.
I didn't say that you should do it, and I didn't say
Right.
that it was right, but I did say that it was legal.
Well, yeah, I know, and that's kind of the bait and switch that you pull, Jordan, quite a bit. Is you say, well, I didn't say it was legal. I didn't say it was right. What do you think is right? Let me ask you this. Let me ask Laserin, what do you think is right as far as how to gender somebody who identifies, who has been abused, has been the victim of hate crimes their whole life, and wants to be referred to by their specific pronouns? What do you think is right?
I think that your attempt to use hypothetical compassion for someone hypothetically oppressed is an appalling way to defend a compelled speech law.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah,
Because think about what that does. It puts you completely in the driver's seat, doesn't it? You get to sit there and think, well, I'm a compassionate, wonderful person with the essential mien of a saint, and this person who's addressing me is obviously entirely corrupt because they don't have the same moral compassion for the oppressed that I do. It's like I'm not even going to engage in that. It's an appalling way of arguing. What makes you think that you're so compassionate? What makes you think that you've got all the right on your side?
because I'm the only.
So you don't think there's anything dangerous about the government attempting to produce compelled speech legislation on the back of hypothetical compassion? You can't see any way that would go wrong?
Well, I'll talk about you.
Then you're not thinking.
You just talked
that
about
sort of thing's gone wrong many times in the past, and you're using your mask of compassion and care for the oppressed to justify whatever actions you want to undertake.
All right, listen, I let you go here. You talk in paragraphs around in circles. Now you're misrepresenting me. I didn't say that at all. I didn't say that I don't see any problems with it. I think I'm the only one in this interview.
You haven't pointed out any problems with it so far.
Well, I'm also the only one who hasn't condemned compassion in any way, shape, or form. And
compassion needs to be condemned in many, many ways because people use it as an unthinking marker for moral virtue, and it's not that at all.
I understand that it can be subjectively condemned, but I'm saying there's one of us here who has advocated it as a virtue, and I think you do well to include that in your rhetoric. This is an opinion.
Yeah, well, I don't buy the idea that compassion is a virtue.
And I don't think that it should be arbitrary. I'm talking about people with, again, the government these are elected officials, and we elect the most qualified people for the job. You cannot elect someone who's the most qualified for the job and then decide that they don't have the authority that you've granted them as a voter.
Yes, you can. That's what a constitution is for.
That is what a constitution is for.
So yes, you absolutely can. The Constitution puts limits on the power of the elected representatives, and partly that's to protect the rights of minorities. And one of the most fundamental rights that minorities have is the right to free speech. It's absolutely unbelievable that the left, who hypothetically are standing up for the rights of the oppressed, are daring to challenge the supremacy of free speech, because it's been the fundamental weapon that people who are dispossessed have used against power structures since the beginning of the right itself. So it's unbelievably short-sighted. And if you think that the restrictions on free speech that are being put in place by the left won't be misused by the right, then you're not thinking at all.
You keep saying that. The Constitution's changed. Some people think that income tax is unconstitutional. Do you think income tax is unconstitutional? Do you think we have to completely do away with income tax? Because we have amendments that deal with that. The point is it's a living, breathing document, right? And the people who have been granted that
It's not living and breathing as much as the radicals who wish to transform it according to their ideology think it is. So, and you mess with constitutional amendments at your peril.
Okay, so
the whole idea here, the fundamental, what would you call it? The fundamental assumption of this whole line of questioning is that your particular ideological stance puts you firmly on the side of the dispossessed, and that makes you admirable and correct. And first of all, I don't buy the argument that you're on the side of the dispossessed merely because you say you do. The fact that you're
a straight white man.
For limitations. Just the fact that you're arguing for limitations on free speech indicates to me that you're no friend whatsoever of people who are truly dispossessed. So,
but those people disagree with you more than me. I mean, how many minorities really are lining up for Jordan Peterson? Right?
Well, I mean, that's a rhetorical question, and there's plenty of people who are so-called minorities that are coming to my talks, for example. You don't have any hard data on that. So
something like 90%, over 90% of Black Americans vote Democrat. It's not even close. Latino Americans, Asian Americans, it's not even close. It's 80 or above for every single demographic. So the point is, right, I don't want to speak for minorities, and I know you don't want to speak for minorities.
but they agree with my stance a lot more. That's how they vote. So it's clear they don't have a problem with a guy like me. And I'm not saying that I'm inherently right. All I'm trying to point out is that I think maybe you're not consistent on freedom of speech. Let's ask this. This just happened this week. Facebook, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, right? They all banned the InfoWars channel. So let me ask you, do you think that's a good thing or that's a bad thing?
No, I think it's a catastrophe.
Okay. So what's your solution? Do you believe Facebook or YouTube should be forced to provide a platform for speech that they detest?
No, I don't think they should be forced. I think that they've bit off far more than they'll be able to chew.
How so?
Because now they've decided that they're ethically responsible for the content on their platforms. So good luck with that decision, because they have an awful lot of content, and drawing the lines is going to be extraordinarily difficult thing to do. So basically, the way that these companies were set up to begin with is that people could post content and then other people could watch it and basically decide by their viewing. They could value the content by their proclivity to view. And now they've decided, as a consequence of this decision, that they're going to be in the business of arbitrarily determining what should and shouldn't be presented for public viewing. And they'll never run out of decisions to make. You know, lots of people who were watching Alex Jones didn't agree with him. They were just keeping an eye on him.
So,
like, I watched Alex Jones from time to time because I wanted to see what the radical conspiratorial right wing was up to.
Right. Yeah.
And now that's not possible. Now they're driven underground.
Way to cover your tracks with your browser history. I appreciate it. Let me ask you this.
There's going to be all sorts of lines that they have to decide now. So they're going to take out Paul Joseph Watson next? Lawrence Southern? I mean, where are they going to draw the line exactly?
Okay, so if it's against their terms of service, isn't it within their domain to revoke the channel? What's the solution?
Of course it is. I didn't say they couldn't do it. I said it was a bad idea.
Okay, so you're not.
That's not the same thing.
Okay, so you don't have a. So,
I think it's.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that they've. I really do believe, and I'm sad about this. I do believe that they've bitten off more than they can chew, and that it's going to be. It's one small. It's a warning sign with regards to these media conglomerates that are attempting to produce large-scale public discourse, because now they've taken the role of censor onto themselves, and they'll find that that's a never-ending role that produces endless trouble. They've got themselves into endless trouble, as far as I'm concerned. And from a perspective of a clinical psychologist, I would also say the worst thing you can do to someone who's paranoid, the most ill-advised thing you can do to someone who's paranoid, is persecute them. Yeah. So now that, I mean, Alex Jones is always talking about, the little I know about him, he's always talking about conspiracies of one form or another. And now what has all the appearance of a conspiracy between 4 or 5 very large media conglomerates is aimed squarely at him. So all the people who are watching him, who are conspiracy-minded and somewhat paranoid, are going to think, well, Jones must be onto something, because otherwise these big conglomerates wouldn't have clamped down on him. No. It's a very, very bad idea, and millions of people watch him. So
these are people who thought that Podesta had an underage sex ring in a pizza parlor. So I don't really think that this is necessarily the straw that broke the camel's back. It sounds to me. So I want to make sure that I clarify. Are you not amongst the people who believe that these big platforms like YouTube, Facebook should be treated like public utilities? Because there are a lot of right wingers who do believe that, like phone.
Yeah, I think they should be treated as public utilities, because otherwise they can't exist. Because there's no possible way that these corporations can handle monitoring their content. There's too much content. So they'll run out of manpower to make the decisions. I mean, so Alex Jones is now being banned. What do you think about people who've interviewed Alex Jones? Should they be banned? That would include Joe Rogan, for example, because he interviewed Alex Jones. Yeah. So should we ban him? Well, and if not, why not?
So you think that Facebook, YouTube, Google, these companies that, basically start up in garages, these tech startups, invest millions of dollars and they grow to become successful, and then you support the government stepping in an authoritarian fashion and telling them who they have to allow on their platforms?
I didn't say the government should step in. I said that they made a mistake by deciding to act as censors, and that they'll pay for it. I didn't say anything about anybody stepping in and changing it. I said it was a mistake.
Well, if they're to be treated like public utilities, then that would be the government stepping in, because right now they're not.
Well, if they were to be treated as public utilities, that would be a transformation in the way they were regulated. So that really doesn't have anything to do specifically with the Alex Jones issue.
Well, I'm just saying you would support it. You would support it.
Okay. And let's reverse the question, because I'm the one having to come up with all the complex answers. All right. Okay. So how would you propose that these complex corporations decide which content is acceptable? Exactly.
no.
How would you propose that?
Exactly, I would propose it. I don't think there does
Yeah.
need to be a proposal. I mean, I think this is where actually I would be on your side. Let the free market decide, and the free market is YouTube and Facebook. And if they don't want to host content, I don't think they should be forced to host content. I don't think they should be compelled to host content.
Well, obviously they shouldn't be. That's not the issue. The issue is how are they going to go about making the decisions, and how are we going to be sure that that won't go dreadfully wrong? I mean, obviously it's the case that censorship can go wrong. You certainly see that in places like China. Once you start with censorship, how do you have any idea how you're going to put proper boundaries around it and decide who's acceptable? You're either going to let your listeners decide that, or you're going to decide it. And then you're going to find out that you've taken on a huge weight of decision making that you can't handle. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that won't happen. But it's certainly, I would be very loath to decide what needs to be censored, because the number of decisions I'd have to make would multiply beyond end.
Well, I'm not saying let any specific individual decide. I'm saying let the free market decide. If people don't want Alex Jones on YouTube, then YouTube doesn't have to provide it. If people watching YouTube don't.
I already agreed that YouTube doesn't have to provide it. I said it was a mistake to engage in censorship.
Sure.
Just because people are allowed to do something doesn't mean it isn't a mistake upon occasion. So I'm not asking for government regulation. And the idea that transforming these corporations into something approximating utilities would be a form of regulation is really and what would you say? It's an ill-formed way of posing the question. It's a matter of classification. Do you think that Alex Jones should be able to use a phone?
I do think Alex Jones should be able to use a phone as long as he pays for it, as long as a phone company wants to offer him their services.
Right, so the phone company offers everyone equal access to the services regardless of content. And I presume you'd object if the phone service started to decide that conversations shouldn't be allowed to occur. And so you can make a reasonable argument that these large-scale media distribution companies play the same role, but on a larger scale. It's not necessarily the case that it's an argument without flaw, but it's a reasonable argument. But I don't think that there's any real alternative. I don't see how companies like Facebook and YouTube can possibly police their content without producing far more trouble than they'll save. That's the issue.
Well, I'm not so much just concerned about them policing the content. What I'm concerned with is, let's say we do the public utility sort of option, right? What I'm concerned with is the free market will be able to provide alternatives. You know, Alex Jones can go there. If we're consistent, and we believe in freedom of speech and the freedom of market as it applies thereof, we should be free to accept, we should follow this down the logical trail that there will be an alternative platform for Alex Jones or you.
Yes, there probably will be. And that's also why I think it was a mistake for these companies to engage in the censorship, because I think that they're signing their own death warrant by doing so. It'll probably take 10 years to unfold, but it's a big mistake. And so that is what will happen, is because people will stop trusting YouTube and Facebook and so forth to provide uncensored access to content. And as a consequence, other forms of information distribution will emerge. So that's why I thought it was a bad decision from a corporate perspective.
Okay.
They had every right to make it, but I think it's a bad decision.
If I were to walk into your house, okay? If I were to walk into your house right now and harass you and call you all sorts of names and get right up in your face and not leave after you've asked me to leave and continue harassing you without any refuge for you, would you think that is a crime for me to do that?
I don't know why you're asking the question. So
well, let me tell you why I'm asking. So now, again, this is why we're talking about the Constitution and guns. Now we have fully automatic AR-15s and things change, right? Times change. We need to adapt, and we've both agreed on that to some extent. Now, online, people like Alex Jones, they have the ability to invade your house digitally, continually, and harass and berate.
You can always shut it off.
Not necessarily. That's the thing. You can't shut off everything. You can't block people. You can't mute people on every platform. Then they can have your email on YouTube. You know, it shows up in your suggested feed. The point is, especially...
No, that's a silly argument. You can just shut the whole thing off if you want. So it's a silly argument. It's not like someone invading your house. So because you can shut it off at any time.
Okay.
No, that's just not going anywhere, that argument.
Well, what if someone has a computer in their house then? If they have a computer in their house, then it means that someone can invade their house that way digitally. There's no way to find a space away from these, particularly people like Alex Jones, most egregious offenders, right, who spread conspiracies and effectively lead to doxing of people. I mean, that's just...
Well, a lot of this, the thing is too, it's again, the question is more fundamental. Let's assume that it's a bad idea for poorly supported conspiracy theories to be formulated and distributed.
Yeah, let's assume that.
Yeah, fine. Well, we don't need to put it in air quotes. We could probably both assume it. The question is, what should you do with people who are doing that? And the one answer is, well, do what you can to silence them and drive them underground. The other is, let them talk and let people make up their own minds. And my sense is that people are wise enough to listen to people of that sort and decide that that's too extreme. Now, not everyone, because conspiracy theorists can find followers among people who are disagreeable and somewhat paranoid, but it's best for everyone, including the conspiracy theorists themselves, that those things are aired in public discussion, because it helps keep people sane. You know, like I've known people who are a little bit on this.
I disagree.
Yeah, but that's because you don't know what you're talking about.
No, I think you're incorrect. Listen, there are more Americans who believe in angels than in climate change. The top shows are Kardashians. Look at what's on television. I don't believe that the American public, that anyone should be granted the same.
It's not the issue.
Yeah, it is. You said that they should be wise. They should treat them wise enough. I'm saying I don't think they're wise enough, and that's why
they're wise enough compared to the alternatives.
Okay.
You know, your system in the United States was never set up under the presumption that the people were wise. It was set up under the presumption that the people, regardless of their wisdom, had the right to self-determination. And even more importantly, that although the people themselves might not always be wise, there isn't a better source of authority than the people themselves. So that no matter how corrupt and foolish the people happen to be, whatever systems you put in place to supplant them will be worse. And so I think that, and you might not believe that, but that's fine. But that is the founding principle of the American system.
I don't believe it.
No, that's fine. You don't have to believe it.
I don't believe that Alex Jones and anyone with a Facebook page is, for example, as qualified and as safe for the American public as Walter Cronkite or people in the Senate and House who are qualified to make these determinations. I don't. That's just a disagreement. But I'll let people, It's
not just a disagreement. It's actually a disagreement about the fundamental structure of the entire political system, because you think that it's possible to produce banks of experts of one sort or another who can supplant the fundamental will of the people. And I think that that's a very bad idea. And I think that history shows that that's a bad idea. At least with democracy, it tends to be self-correcting. So if people make egregious errors, they correct them in the next election.
Well, okay.
And so,
sorry, I want to give you a so again, that is selfauthoring.com if people want to take your quiz, and the book 12 Rules for Life is available at places. So let me final question. Does it ever concern you that you might be on the wrong side of history?
What mostly concerns me is whether I make a mistake when I'm talking, and so I'm not thinking about the wrong side of history precisely. So does it concern me that I might be making mistakes? That concerns me all the time. But I thought the things that I say through very carefully, and I'm perfectly willing to live or die by them, let's say. So.
Well, I ask you that because we've gone through a litany of using people's preferred pronouns, the idea of compassion, neither of which do you support, and then we've gone through things like Alex Jones and extremists in social media, and these are ideas that I wonder if you constantly finding yourself defending just bad people, and even if you're not one, if you
mostly what I find myself doing is being supported by a very large number of people, and being, what would you call, put on the spot in various uncomfortable ways by a tiny, noisy minority of radical collectivists. So that's mostly what I feel, or mostly what I experience.
Isn't it
wrong side of history.
Isn't it your buddy Shapiro who says facts don't care about your feelings? So if that's how you feel, I'm sorry, that's not my intent here. But again, that is selfauthoring.com, 12 Rules for Life. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thanks for taking the time. Listen, man, I mean, you have your point of view and I have mine, and there it is.
Hey, if you like this video, subscribe, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot, so you can hit the notification bell. I know that Skyler was incredibly unpleasant with Dr. Jordan Peterson. I wanted to kick his ass, so I get it. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, join Mug Club, or watch one of these other videos that could be playing in a box somewhere. Maybe YouTube's banned it at this point. Who knows? Who knows?